This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into episode 26 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And for today's episode, we will be looking at waiver wire targets ahead of Week 7. But before we do that, I want to let you know that you can follow and interact with us on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. And you can also email the show at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's get into the waiver wire targets for Week 7. Now let's start with the running back position. And the good news this week is that if you are in need of running back help, there's quite a few options available on the waiver wire this week. And there's two backfields that I would be prioritizing as a target. First, let's talk about the Chicago Bears backfield and rookie Roschon Johnson, currently 42% owned according to ESPN leagues. Now, Johnson did miss Week 6 due to a concussion, but that really shouldn't stop fantasy managers from making him a priority add this week. Now, starting running back Khalil Herbert was placed on IR prior to the Week 6 contest, meaning he's going to be out at least the next 3 games. Deontay Foreman did have a majority of the carries. He had 15 of 26 running back carries in Week 6, but prior to Herbert's injury, Roschon Johnson was working ahead of Deontay Foreman. I think this means that once Johnson returns to the lineup healthy, he is going to operate as the lead back in the Chicago offense. Now, Justin Fields could also be out in Week 7 with a hand injury, and the Chicago offense could become even more run-oriented. Now, I did look back at the Bears running back opportunity splits with and without Justin Fields in the lineup. And since 2021, the Bears running back unit was averaging 2.5 more carries and 1.5 more targets per game, resulting in about 3 more fantasy points per game when Fields was out of the lineup. The other backfield that's going to be a priority this week is going to be the 49ers backfield. Now, there's 2 players here that we could possibly target. The first is going to be Elijah Mitchell. He is at 26% owned in ESPN leagues. And the other player that I would slightly prefer would be Jordan Mason, who's currently owned at 1% right now in ESPN leagues. Now, of course, starting running back Christian McCaffrey suffered an oblique injury. That forced him out of the Week 6 game. I think it kind of remains to be seen how long McCaffrey will be out. My guess will be a 1-week injury, but it could be more serious than that. But as for these 2 players, Mason and Mitchell, I think a lot of people viewed Elijah Mitchell as Christian McCaffrey's primary backup, but it was Jordan Mason who actually played more snaps, 15-2, and received more carries, 5-2, than Mitchell did after CMC exited the game. Now, it's likely that neither player will kind of receive that CMC-like workload, right? I mean, Christian McCaffrey was an elite player in an elite offense getting elite usage. So that's not going to continue with either player. But both players will still receive, maybe 40 to 60% of the running back touches. That would be about 10 to 15 touches each, and in the San Francisco offense, that still has quite a bit value there, right? We're talking about running back 3 value with running back 2 upside. Now, if Elijah Mitchell was healthy, I think he would be the priority add here. He was really good his rookie year in 11 games. However, he regressed pretty significantly last year because he was injured. He only played in 5 games, and he's barely played much this season as well because he's been injured. I think Jordan Mason is the guy that we want. Mason is averaging over 5 yards a carry, and he recorded a PFF grade of 92.5 over the last 2 seasons. That would be second best among all running backs. I think that makes him the higher upside option in this offense. So to recap, I am definitely recommending that you target both, but I would recommend Mason as the priority over Mitchell. Another running back who could be a Week 7 streamer due to an injury will be Lions running back Craig Reynolds, currently owned in only 7% of ESPN leagues. Now, David Montgomery, he left the Week 6 game early due to a rib injury. I think early reports indicate Montgomery is likely to miss Week 7, but not a long-term injury. Rookie Jahmyr Gibbs has missed the last 2 weeks due to a hamstring injury. And look, if Montgomery and Gibbs can't go next week, Reynolds will be the next man up. Zonovan Knight is currently on IR, and look, this backfield, which looked like a strength early in the year, is now pretty depleted. Now, for Craig Reynolds, he played 43 snaps in Week 6, and look, he plays behind one of the best offensive lines in the league, one of the better offenses in the NFL that love to run the football in the red zone. And if Gibbs were to return, even based on early season utilization, I think Reynolds still will have a sizable role in Week 7, especially considering the fact that Gibbs could very well be on a snap count following a 2-week absence from a hamstring injury. In addition, in Week 3, when David Montgomery was out and it was just Reynolds and Gibbs, they both played a similar amount of snaps. So I think Reynolds can be a streaming option for you if you are in need of a running back in Week 7. And then the other running back of note here for the Week 7 waiver wire is going to be Browns running back Kareem Hunt. He's currently at 27% ownership in ESPN leagues. Now, following Cleveland's Week 5 bye, the Browns clearly wanted to get Hunt more involved. Now, Jerome Ford is still the lead back in what is quickly becoming more of a committee situation. Jerome Ford had 51% snap participation in Week 6. Kareem Hunt was at 37%. That was his highest mark of the year. Jerome Ford, slightly higher in total opportunities, mainly based on the fact that he had 5 more carries, 17-12, but they ran the same number of routes. Kareem Hunt got 1 more target, 3-2. The main difference here is that Kareem Hunt got the touchdown, as opposed to Jerome Ford had no touchdowns. Hunt outscored Ford 16-11. Now, my main takeaway from this offense is that this is going to look more like a committee situation. So I'm more concerned about Jerome Ford being in your starting lineup on a go-forward basis as opposed to Kareem Hunt being a waiver wire target. With that being said, Kareem Hunt still, I think, has some value as running back depth on your bench. Now, as for wide receivers, there's going to be 2 wide receivers, both of which are rookies that I think you should be considering as your waiver wire targets ahead of Week 7. The first is going to be Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver Rashee Rice, who is currently owned in only 30% of ESPN leagues. Now, let's first focus on Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Sky Moore. These are 2 guys who have just really failed as the lead wide receivers through the first 6 weeks of the season. Now, Sky Moore is currently averaging only 3.5 targets per game, about 24 yards receiving. MVS is even worse. He's at 2 targets per game, 19 yards receiving per game. These 2 guys are leading the team in both snaps played and routes run, but have just outright failed from a fantasy standpoint. Rice, on the other hand, he is averaging 4.5 targets per game, 3.5 receptions, and 41 receiving yards. Rice has accomplished this on roughly 33% of the team's dropbacks through 6 weeks. Rice has led Kansas City's wide receivers in fantasy points, even though he's only playing as a part-timer in 5 of 6 games. Rashee Rice now leads the entire Chiefs wide receiver room in targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, even though he hasn't seen anywhere near the same opportunity volume as Sky Moore or MVS. Now, what's most important here is that in Week 6, Rashee Rice's route participation finally started moving in the right direction. He climbed above 50% for the first time this year. And Rice's role may still be limited, but it is accelerating. He's not a player I would feel comfortable immediately putting into my starting lineup in Week 7, but he is the sort of player on the rise that I would love to stash for the second half of the season as his usage continues to climb. And then the other rookie is Seahawks rookie Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's a little bit over 50% owned right now. He's at 56% ownership in ESPN leagues, but in Week 6, JSN set career highs in snaps, routes run, and receiving yards. JSN ranked 3rd in routes per game at 23 routes per game behind DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett in weeks 1 through 5. But in Week 6, all 3 of those players were tied with 39 routes each, indicating a potential increase in his role and an opportunity for JSN going forward. So, similar to Rashee Rice, I would not start JSN in Week 7, but he's another player that I would love to hold on my bench as a second half breakout candidate. Lastly, at the tight end position, I have 2 recommendations this week. First, it's going to be rookie Michael Mayer of the Las Vegas Raiders, currently owned in 1% of ESPN leagues. Now, it looked like the Raiders finally took the rookie shackles off of Michael Mayer in Week 6. He had been limited to 12 personnel for most of the season, but he played almost 75% of snaps in 11 personnel in Week 6. And the rookie set new career highs in snap share route participation, and target share. If we do a side-by-side of his rates from weeks 1 through 5, here's what that looks like. His snap participation on average was 52% in weeks 1 through 5. It jumped to 82% in week 6. His route participation was 34%, went up to 70% in week 6. And his target share was at 3% in weeks 1 through 5. It jumped to 19% in week 6. This is his first game over 80% snap participation, and it led to 15 fantasy points. I would recommend waiting another week before placing Mayer in your starting lineup, but if this becomes a trend, Mayer could become the number 3 target earner in this offense. And then the other tight end is going to be second-year Arizona Cardinal Trey McBride, who has less than 1% ownership in ESPN leagues. Now, McBride caught 4 passes for 62 yards, both of which led all Cardinals players in Week 6. McBride also played 9 more snaps than Zach Ertz, and they were similar in routes run and targets. Now, in Week 6, the major change that occurred here is that Trey McBride played 30 out of 60 snaps in 11 personnel compared to only 27 for Zach Ertz. This is McBride's highest snap share of his career when Zach Ertz was also eligible and active. Now, given Zach Ertz's target volume early in the year, if McBride were to fully take over as the starting tight end, McBride could flirt with tight end 1 production for the second half of the season. So that will wrap up episode 26 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. That'll help others find the show. We'll have more episodes later this week as we look at a full recap of Week 6, looking at key observations and trends from around the league. And then we'll also look ahead with players that you should not be afraid to start ahead of Week 7. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.